Hello, welcome to the plant party. Today we'll be doing everything wetlands. This plant party is hosted by Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Plant Party is a quarterly webinar series intended for advanced plant training and fun education. I'm Tim Sigmund, the Private Lands Program Leader with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. My co-hosts are Charles Kniper, State Resource Conservationist with USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, and Megan Clayton, Professor and Extension Range Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. We have 22 wonderful door prizes we'll be giving away as part of today's event. Our door prize donors today are committed to supporting you in your quest to learn more about plants. I'd like to thank Bamert Seed, Enview Range and Pasture, Quail Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service Aquatic Diagnostics Laboratory, Texas Brigades, and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service for donating these neat prizes. Our first presenter today is Taylor Garrison. Taylor is currently a wildlife biologist with TPWD Wildlife District 5. He's assigned a 4-county area that includes Dallas, Ellis, Kaufman, and Navarro counties. His primary role is working with private landowners, facilitating habitat management projects, and conducting wildlife surveys. He's also developed an extensive local plant ID knowledge over his 8-year tenure with TPWD. Taylor will be presenting on what is a wetland, function, and common plant species.
Good. So today I will be giving a presentation on wetlands, their function, and common plant species around wetlands. I've wanted to appreciate many different plants and wetland types in my work areas, so I'm pleased to provide this presentation to you today. What is a wetland? Essentially, it's wet plus land, so wetland, correct? So easy enough to understand. But no, there's actually a few definitions out there, and I chose one from the EPA. As a government employee, I'm required to use acronyms. So the Environmental Protection Agency defines a wetland as areas where water covers the soil or is present either at or near the surface of the soil all year or for varying periods of time during the year, including during the growing season. So wetlands do not have to be wet 24/7, 365 days a year. They can be wet only for a portion of that, and that will have a strong influence on what type of wetland it might be. In general, what affects a wetland is hydrology. So that's simply the movement of water in relation to land. And for our purposes, that's the inflow and outflow of water. Soils are also a big factor. And if you recall from Soils 101, if you ever took that class or biology, clay soils have a very high water holding capacity, low permeability. And so that could kind of cause more water holding in a wetland, whereas deep sands are very highly permeable and low water holding. And so water might not be able to hold as much, maybe only during portions of the year. So that can affect what type of wetland it might be. In general, there are two basic types of wetlands. So we have coastal or tidal wetlands, obviously found along the Texas Gulf Coast. And, these are affected by shorelines. As you can see, the nice beach here. I'm not sure if our Texas coast has beaches this pretty, but at times we might. And then also inland or non-tidal wetlands. So those are more freshwater based wetlands. And you can see the pond here as a fun cartoon example. So jumping straight into what makes a wetland. So as I mentioned, hydrology is simply just that water saturation component, the inflow or outflow of water. Prolonged saturation is the key here. So if it's flooded for most of the year, maybe 9 out of 12 months, then you might end up with hydric soils. And that is simply saturated soils leading to anaerobic conditions. So lower oxygen potential there. And then that kind of leads to hydric or hydrophytes, which are water-loving plants, aquatic plants as we know them. And so some wetlands might not have as much hydric soil component or water-loving plants. Other factors that can affect wetlands, which there are a myriad of them, are, as we said a minute ago, soils, topography, so the point on the landscape, below a hillside or in a drainage, the regional and local climate, water chemistry, which can be affected by what water source it might be. So is it runoff? Is it groundwater? What is the quality of that water entering that wetland? Then also the vegetation growing around wetlands. That can tell us a lot about what's there and what type of wetland it might be. And of course, human disturbance or human creation. So we do have artificial wetlands managed for duck habitat or just water control, and also retention ponds for flood abatement. And Daffy Duck, either way, appreciates most wetlands, so he's okay with this information. What type of wetlands do we have? So in general, if y'all want to get down into the mess and dirty of it, you can go on Google after this presentation, and there are several classification systems that are pretty detailed through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or the Corps of Engineers. So I won't go too much into detail on those, but we'll look at some common names of wetlands. These are some of the favorites I pulled up the other day on Google. They've been called billabongs, which is an Aussie term for an oxbow lake, a mire, which is a mucky or muddy pond, lagoons, and then pantanals, which is what a big wetland might be called in South America. But for our presentation, we'll cover the basic types, and that includes marshes, which can be tidal or non-tidal, a swamp, which is a wetland dominated by woody plants, so that can be forested with trees or shrubs alone. And then also bogs, which in our climate in Texas, those are precosins. That's the proper term, but we do have a northern type of bog too. I won't go into detail there because that's outside of Texas. And then we do have fins as well. And so I'll kind of briefly describe each one and cover plants that are found in each type. So first up is marshes. So this is an example from western Anderson County along the Trinity River, kind of a natural marsh in a Trinity River bottomland. And marshes essentially are wetlands that are frequently or continually inundated with water. And usually that water comes from runoff and potentially a groundwater source. So emergent vegetation are the vegetation that classifies these. They're usually not that wooded, but in some situations they could have woody encroachment due to management. Examples include potholes, playas, playa lakes, vernal pools, wet meadows. There's many different types of marshes. In this example, we have several species that are associated with these type of marshes that are natural on the Trinity River. So we have bald cypress, which is a really unique tree that's found throughout the Edwards Plateau, portions of East Texas, and also up to Caddo Lake, which are those trees in the background. We also have black willow, which this is a small tree, kind of shrub on the edge, but black willows can get quite large. They prefer to have wet feet, but they can be along the edge of a riverbank, along a pond as well, and they are a native tree. We also have bulrush, which we'll see quite a bit today in our presentation, but these guys usually like not too deep of water, but they can thrive on the edge or within water as well. And as you might recall, rushes have round stems. They're grass-like, and usually they provide a good seed source for a lot of wetland-loving birds like waterfowl. We also have emergent or floating within the pond duckweed, a limna species. And so duckweed are a pretty important plant for creating oxygen and improving the quality of that wetland, and we usually see those in quite a few wetland examples. Moving on to more of an artificial marsh type situation. This is a marsh at Richland Creek WMA in northern Freestone County, also on the edge, southeastern corner of Navarro County. And these marshes are a complex of about 2,000 acres that's managed by Parks and Wildlife and the Tarrant Regional Water District. And these marshes are built solely or dually for waterfowl habitat, public hunting, but also cleaning and naturally filtering water that comes out of the Trinity River to pump back up to Tarrant County for human drinking water. So it's quite a unique situation, one of the few wetlands of its type, but we do have a byproduct of wetland plant diversity and waterfowl use. In this case, this is kind of the lower end of that marsh system, but we do have several species to kind of note in this picture. So we have crowfoot sedge, which is sedges have edges, whereas rushes are rounded stems. Another grass-like species. So crowfoot sedge is one that can create a monoculture. It does prefer wet or semi-wet situations, but due to management, at times it can kind of dominate a bottomland or a wet area, especially on a wet year. But either way, it does have a good food source for some ducks and structure. We also have balloon vine, which is a non-native vine native to Africa. Cardiospermum halicacobum, one of the most more fun names to say in the plant world. But these guys will grow in typically clay soils, upland pastures that are wet, bottomlands and marshes as well. They're not too much of an issue, but they are present in several of our marshes. We also have bulrush again, kind of growing along this wetter side of the marsh. And of course, our friend the dragonfly. So this guy decided to photobomb this photo I took the other day to kind of show this wetland to you. So a lot of good wildlife and plants will utilize wetlands. Another example from the same area at Richland Creek WMA. In this marsh, we have a few species that are dominating. This is one that's more managed well for ducks, and so things kind of worked out this spring. But I didn't quite mention it earlier, but these wetlands are usually inundated during the winter for duck habitat and then slowly drawn down in the spring to allow for annual vegetation growth for seed production for waterfowl use. But here we have barnyard grass, which is a non-native grass, unfortunately, but it is one that is preferred in some wetlands because it has a high seed production for ducks. And so typically it doesn't grow too far away from wetter situations like this. So it's not as much of an issue as a non-native grass, but it does dominate some of these wetlands. And we also have a smartweed, which there are a variety of species in this group, but these are very relished by several duck species as providing a lot of seed for ducks. And of course, our friend the bulrush, taller example there. Moving on to another wetland at the same area. This one has had some deeper water this spring. And so you can see in the background in that lower left photo, this is American lotus, Columbia lutea. So it's one species that is native. It's a really pretty and vibrant flower, but it does occur when you have deeper water situations. So this particular marsh probably had greater than 3 feet of water depth. And now you have a monoculture of this particular species. And so not necessarily a bad thing, but if you're trying to enhance diversity of wetland plants for ducks and other wildlife habitat, kind of keep in mind of how high that water level is during the growing season. And we also have duckweed kind of growing along the margins of this canal through the marsh. Again, and also in the lower portion of the photo is where I'm at the levee of the wetland. We have halberd leaf hibiscus. And so there's several hibiscus species present in Texas, especially in East Texas, that will are kind of a woody flowering plant that do grow along the banks. So other examples of vegetation that you could find in a marsh are grassy arrowhead, and that's Sagittaria gramineae in the top left. A really common forage species. It's a perennial that will occupy ditches, kind of wet areas, marshes. It doesn't do too well in deep water, but will be present in a wet soil situation. We also have smartweed again, kind of a closer photo of the flowers in the middle. And we have cattail in the top right, so typha species. And cattails are one that grow in many wetlands, but typically they're managed for because they can create a monoculture. Even though they're native, they can take over a marsh and shroud out diversity. We also have the black willow again in the left central photo. That's the flowers of black willow, and a non-native woody called Chinese tallow, which I'm sure some folks here have dealt with in their portion of the state, especially along the Gulf Coast, but in East Texas as well. So Chinese tallow will take over wetlands, and I see it quite a bit in my work area. We also have buttonbush, which is a native shrub with a really good pollinator value from its flowers. These guys are also managed for and managed wetlands because they can kind of take over and shroud out diversity as well. So the theme here is kind of annual plant diversity for seed production is what a lot of folks are looking for. We also see eastern cottonwood along bottomlands and also in some of these marsh situations in clay soils. And of course, our friend the duckweed. And then next to the duckweed is Hooker's oringo, which is a member of the carrot family. You might be familiar with rattlesnake master. This is a smaller species that's common in clay upland prairies that are more wet, swales, bottomlands, and marshes as well. But they're a really unique flower that can explode on years like this year where you have a lot of spring and summer rainfall. And another really unique wetland plant in the bottom right is blue mud plantain. And I found this guy at a spring pool that was spring fed at Gus Engling WMA. So kind of a sandy pool that was seasonally wet. And these guys were covering those 4 or 5 or 6 inches of water in that pool. And there was a lot of little bugs and even reptiles and amphibians utilizing that water source. Kind of a unique area. So moving on to another type of marsh. These are tidal marshes. So along the Gulf Coast, we have what we call a high tidal marsh or a low tidal marsh. So it just kind of depends on how close it is to the shoreline. Then also those can be brackish or freshwater or saltwater. So we have a mix of what type of water, depending on that placement of that tidal marsh along the Texas Gulf Coast. And so this particular example is from Powderhorn WMA, one of Parks and Wildlife's new WMA purchases or partnerships with Texas Nature Conservancy on the coast. And in this example, we have a more salty marsh close to the bay. And this is smooth cordgrass kind of dominating these patches along the marsh. So that's Spartina alterniflora. And it's a very common grass species that occurs in some of these tidal marshes. But habitat and the function of these is really for kind of stormy sea protection. And so as hurricanes come through and coastal storms, these wetlands kind of buffer those tidal inflows. They protect from hurricanes. They protect from shoreline erosion, but also they provide a fantastic amount of habitat for plants and animals. So crabs and clams, juvenile fish, whooping cranes that are migrating through or utilizing these habitats during the growing season, and also several other species of waterfowl. So moving on to swamps. And so swamps, as I mentioned earlier, are in wetland that's dominated by woody plants typically. So these are usually associated close to a stream or a drainage or a river. They can be treed or shrubby. In this example, this is a cypress swamp in the Edwards Plateau. And so kind of looks like an East Texas photo, but we do have these in the hill country as well. So again, we have bald cypress, Taxodium distichum, again in this photo, and we also have dwarf palmetto, which are both species, again, that are found in East Texas. But I do know that these swamps in the hill country have some really unique adapted plant species like orchids and several other wildflowers that occupy them. So pretty unique type wetland there. Moving on to kind of East Texas as well, we have more in the background, more the bald cypress, but we also have Chinese tallow again, kind of dominating the shorelines or the edges of Caddo Lake in the left photo. And we also have an example from a creek in East Texas in the right with some of the bald cypress, but also overcup oak in that photo, kind of overhanging that swamp there. So two different examples of what you might see in East Texas. In fact, swamps can be also associated with bottomland hardwood forests. So you could call a bottomland riparian forest a swamp as well. So in this example, we have box elder, which is a very common kind of swamp species or bottomland hardwood forest species. And we also have green ash in the right side of the picture. And so we see a lot of those at my location, Richland Creek WMA, but also in East Texas and other portions of the state. Other examples of woodies in these marshes, in these swamps are bur oak, overcup oak, water oak, American elm, sugarberry, cottonwood, and pecan. So moving on to probably my favorite wetland type that I've worked a lot in more recently are bogs. So there's not many of these in Texas, and very few I've had the chance to see them, but I'll kind of cover some of the basics of bogs in Texas. And so bogs are ambrootrophic, another fancy word. So that basically means that bogs receive most of their water from rainfall rather than groundwater runoff. In Texas, these are found usually between an upland or a tall sandhill and a bottomland drainage. And so they're kind of along the middle point of that topography, and they're associated with deep sand soils. So usually you have 80 plus inches of sand, and you have a clay layer down below real deep that catches water from rainfall or runoff permeating through that soil. For rainfall. And those kind of fill in these bogs at times. And then the sphagnum peat moss that grows in these bogs will capture that water and hold it in place. These bogs are usually nutrient poor due to the acidity of the deep sand area. And so you have a very low nutrient quality to it, but a species rich environment for plants. And so a lot of plants have adapted to growing in these really intense situations. And so that's why we see plants like the swamp milkweed or red milkweed, Asclepias rubra. So as you might know, milkweeds are a host plant for monarch butterflies. And in some of these bogs, if they're managed well, we'll have a lot of these red milkweeds growing throughout them. But I'll kind of cover some of the main species through bogs and some examples in East Texas. And so the first photo is a bog found in northern Leon County. And so this bog is one that's actually in a highway right-of-way, but it has not been managed with fire very well. In fact, probably 15 plus years without fire. And so you have a lot of woody encroachment. But hidden from view due to how woody it is the pitcher plant in the lower left. And so Sarracenia alata is the scientific name there. And it's one of the several carnivorous plants found in bogs that typify what they might be called. But in this example with woody plants, we have loblolly pine, which is growing in and along the margins of the bog. We have possum high viburnum, which is related to black haw, rusty black haw viburnum, which is more common in sandy upland woods. But we also have some grasses. So grasses and sedges and rushes, in fact, dominate these typical bogs as far as herbaceous growth. And so this particular grass is Dicanthelium scoparium, which is velvet panikin. And these guys are pretty common throughout most bogs in East Texas. We also have the pitcher plant again. We have giant plume grass, which is another grass species that will occupy these bogs. These guys can get upwards of 14 feet tall on a good year. We also have sweet gum, which is a really unique plant. I should have showed a close-up of the leaf, but it reminds me of the Land Before Time, tree star leaf. So it has that same shape. And these guys grow in typically more wet, mucky bottomland situations or bogs as well. We also have water oak, Quercus nigra, which is common throughout many different wetter situations, but they do occupy some of these bogs as well. And then American beautyberry, which is occupying the margins of this bog. But as you can see, this one needs fire, and so hopefully at some point we'll get a fire through it to open it up more. Moving on to kind of the edge of this bog, and so this is an example of one portion or the edge of the bog that what I might call a wet meadow, so more of a marshy situation. It only really holds water during the spring months, just a few inches at most. And so you kind of have a wet prairie situation here. And so plants like cat-tailed gayfeather, which is related to the prairie gayfeather or dotted gayfeather, will really do well in these kind of wet areas along the margins. We also have broom sedge bluestem, which is related to big bluestem, Andropogon virginicus on this species. But little bluestem and big blue will also grow in these. I've seen switchgrass, Panicum virgatum as well. But we also have right in the middle swamp sunflower, which is a really unique member of the Asteraceae family that occupies these wetter areas. But as I said, these are just seasonally wet and are really important for a lot of wildlife and plant species. Some typical plant species to find in bogs. So in the top left, we have the two other carnivorous plant species. So we have the sundew, Drosera species. There's a few native to Texas. And these are really unique kind of small, tiny plants that occupy the more open areas of the bog. We also have bladderwort, Uticularia species. So there's at least 4 or 5 species I know of native to Texas. And these are also carnivorous. And they're actually known as having the most complex network of cell walls within their structures. And so within their network of roots and stems, there's these little bladders that kind of open up and let in bugs and other microscopic invertebrates. And it will eat them for nutrients. Remember that bogs have very low nutrients available. And so plants like these carnivorous plants have adapted to eat living things to make up for that nutrient deficiency. We also have bog buttons, which can dominate some of these bogs after a fire. In the top right, so little tiny white buttons there. And there's several species in Texas. And in fact, there is one species that is globally rare and an endangered species found in a few of these Texas bogs. Occupying the margins and within the bogs, again, are the swamp sunflower in the bottom left. This one resembles the Maximilian sunflower we know of in our prairies. We also have pale lobelia. So lobelia is the genus for cardinal flower. You might have seen in East Texas, the red flower lobelia. And this one, pale lobelia, likes wet, mesic areas and bog margins. It will grow in bottomlands as well. And then the flowers of possum high viburnum in the bottom right. And so a woody species will occupy the middle of the bog and the edges as well. So moving on to the last wetland type that is not as familiar or common in Texas, but we do have a few. These are called fens. And so fens are a peat-forming wetland that receives its nutrients typically from resources other than precipitation. So usually runoff or groundwater movement create wet situations in these wetlands. And so fens can actually turn into a bog if sphagnum moss grows throughout them. But typically in Texas, these are found in the rolling plains. And so there's been a few fins described in areas like Gene Howe WMA and a few other private ranches within the lower part of the Panhandle and the Rolling Plains. And so typically these fins in Texas hold more prairie grass species that can deal with more water. So things like eastern gammon grass, switchgrass, big blue stem. We also have a really unique milkweed as well that kind of comes into Texas only in these areas of the Panhandle and the Rolling Plains. It's showy milkweed, so Sclepia speciosa, which is more common outside of Texas, but we do see it in some of our Texas fins and wet areas. So another example of a fin in the Rolling Plains. So this one does have eastern cottonwood along the margins as well. And willow baccharis salicina is also a common woody species. You can kind of see in the wet areas in the middle part of this photo, we have a lot of sedge, grass, and rush species that occupy these. One thing that's unique about these fins in Texas is they are permanently saturated but never flooded. So there's always a wet soil component, but there's usually not a standing water situation. And so that kind of gives note to why we see more prairie grass species occupying some of these fins in Texas. Typically, they have a kind of a herbaceous, decaying herbaceous material in the soil with peat and sometimes mixed with sand. And usually they're over an impervious clay layer similar to bogs. And so that clay layer kind of holds the water in there, keeping that soil wet. The last example from a fin in the Rolling Plains in Texas, this one has a dominance of eastern gammon grass, so Tripsacum dactyloides. An important tallgrass prairie species that likes more wetter situations. But other species included in these fins are prairie cordgrass, false indigo bush, roughleaf dogwood, which is common throughout a lot of Texas, American elm again, cottonwood, and a few willow species, including black willow and coyote willow. And so these are really neat that I hope to visit at some point soon in the Rolling Plains. So that kind of wraps up our presentation. So to close off with another photo from my office at Richland Creek WMA. But if you have any questions, feel free to reach me by cell phone. In the bottom left corner, I have my contact information there, or by email. And I'll be glad to take any questions you might have.
Thanks for that presentation, Taylor. Fantastic. But to continue on this theme of wetlands, we invite Heather Johnson with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to discuss playas, the rarely considered wetland. Heather's been a waterfowl biologist for 12 years and has worked with waterfowl and habitat across the western United States, from Alaska to coastal regions of Oregon, the northern plains of Montana and North Dakota, the central plains of Colorado and Nebraska, and now in the hot southern plains of Texas. During those years, she worked with the playa wetlands for 6 years in the rainwater basin of Nebraska, and now in the Texas Panhandle for over 2 years. Welcome, Heather. We're excited to hear your presentation.
So we'll kind of go ahead and jump in. Let's go ahead and kind of define what a playa is. Playas exist all over the world. Out here in the Panhandle of Texas, they're rain-fed systems. They're plate shaped. So if you think of, they're not really bowl shaped, but like the bottom is very flat and then it has a slight incline along the sides. So entirely rain-fed. Out in this region, they also are important for aquifer recharge. They're kind of the vectors for recharge, and they're fairly closed systems. So you typically, sometimes if you get a lot of rain, there'll be some connectivity, but typically they're pretty closed. The water, it rains, the water flows in, and then it either infiltrates through the ground or is evaporated out. Doesn't flow necessarily into like river systems and so on. And they're also ephemeral by nature. So they're actually dry. They have wet dry cycles, and that's really important to their functionality. So here's a really nice animation that Playa Lakes Joint Venture did that kind of summarizes how playas work in the plains of Texas.
Healthy playas are a primary source of groundwater recharge and provide important year-round habitat for birds and other wildlife. Unlike many other wetlands, playas have an irregular wet-dry cycle, which is key to how they function. When dry, the clay soil in the basin contracts and forms large cracks. Tiny seeds and eggs from the last wet period lay dormant in the soil, sometimes for several years, waiting for a heavy rainfall to germinate or hatch. When the rain falls, the first flush of water from surrounding uplands flows toward the playa. As water moves through the grasses surrounding the playa, many sediments that may carry contaminants from farm fields are trapped and stopped from entering the playa. The water continues into the playa basin and into the cracks, beginning its journey to the underlying aquifer. Once the clay soil becomes saturated, the cracks close, allowing the playa to hold water. Wetland plants and invertebrates begin to grow and complete their life cycles. Migrating birds and other prairie wildlife use the playa for much needed rest stops, water, and food. Water continues to seep into the soil and slowly moves downward along roots and small channels, as well as along the playa's perimeter. Some of the water in the playa is used by plants, but most evaporates and the soil soon dries. Prairie winds scour the playa basin, blowing out some of the sediments that have found their way into the playa. Cracks reappear in the clay soil. The playa awaits the next storm, when the cycle will repeat.
All right, so I have some really cool animations. So here's like that big crack that they talked about in the clay soil, and then here's that water flowing in as shortly after a rainstorm had started. And then eventually that clay soil swells and you get some ponding and wildlife comes to life with some amphibians there. And then you get your vegetation starts to growing in that moist soil. Here's just a schematic of how playas work. It rains, fills the playa, you get recharge and infiltration, transpiration and evaporation as well occurs. So some common misconceptions of playas. The Ogallala Aquifer, which is the aquifer which our playas sit on top of, is all fossil water. Since we have found, modern agricultural contaminants and other contaminants, we've been shown that that's not true, that the aquifer is getting recharged primarily from our playas. Because playas are dry most of the time, some people think that they don't play a significant role in aquifer recharge and habitat. Again, not true. In a 2-inch, 3-inch rain event, you can get significant recharge when that playa is dry and then gets wet. The amount of recharge supplies doesn't provide enough water to make a difference. You'll see some numbers here in the future that'll show just from the restored playas that it does make a difference. But I will emphasize that recharge is not enough recharge to handle modern agricultural practices, especially irrigation. However, it is enough recharge to support livestock operations as well as municipalities and people. And then modifying, I hear this a lot actually, modifying playas such as digging pits, punching holes increases recharge. In many cases, it actually decreases recharge. And then, the punching holes, it typically sedimentizes in very quickly, it doesn't work. And then you're also opening yourself up to some increase in contamination from the surrounding landscape. So playas and groundwater. So playas exist all the way up through just southern South Dakota, well, into the Rainwater Basin region where I was in Nebraska. That's that part outside of the Playa Lake Joint Venture region. And it extends all the way down into the South Plains, Midland, and Odessa area. Recharge of aquifers. So water movement is actually very slow. Today's rain could take upwards of 50 years to actually reach the aquifer. And most of the movement is vertical. Horizontal movement is extremely slow. It takes hundreds of years just to move, a few feet horizontally. Rate of recharge through a playa itself is upwards of 10 to 1,000 times greater than the surrounding landscape. Healthy playas, which we'll talk about more later, what a healthy playa is, ensures that the water is cleaner before it enters the aquifer. In our region, the Ogallala Aquifer is pretty compartmentalized. So when we have recharge through a playa on a person's property, that recharge pretty much stays within, that area. And then recharge rates. So 3-inch rainfall on a 4-acre playa will provide an acre-foot of water, which is 326,000 gallons annually. And that's enough water for a family of 4 for 2 years. So true to Texan nature, we have not only the most playas than all the other states, but we also have the largest playas than all the other states that have playas. But of those, only a fraction of them are actually truly functional, healthy playas. Some are what we call at risk. That's ones that are being farmed through. They kind of are functional, but they're at risk of being sedimentized in. And then over 13,000 completely non-functional, has been altered in some way that they're not recharging properly. Vegetation's not growing properly in those and so forth. So let's dive a little deeper. So soils in playas. So as we talked about, playas are very ephemeral, especially in the South Plains. They can be dry for upwards of several years, which is partly why the struggle of them being classified as wetlands in a way, because they're dry for several years instead of on a regular annual basis. However, they do have those hydric soils, and when they do get wet, we get those moist soil plants and they'll hold water. But sometimes that holding water can be very short, especially if we've been in a long drought. It can only be maybe wet for a few days, upwards to several months. It just depends how much moisture we've gotten in this region over a period of time. It also depends what's underneath it and how quick either that water infiltrates through the ground, or if it's really hot, we have very fast rates of evaporation. So Randall clay is kind of the most common in Texas, not in Texas, I would say in the Panhandle and our playas. There are a couple other clay types, but Randall clay is the most common. And obviously that left picture is a nice clay layer with those big cracks in them. So here's just kind of a soil map of a typical playa. So the left side is showing, your soil maps. Playas will always, have that clay layer, and then it's usually surrounded by a clay loam or a sandy loam at the peripheral, and then it goes out. So you almost always see this ring around playas as well. If you look to the right, this is something that we try to work with producers about, is the quality of the soil in terms, especially for farm production. I mean, it's great quality for wetland plants. It's poor quality when it comes to agricultural production. It typically actually causes a producer to spend more money trying to farm it rather than leaving it alone. So that's part of the education process. However, those peripheral ranges can actually be very high production for a land producer. So playas themselves, over 350 different plant species. I'm obviously not going to list them all here today. Many birds and other animals are very reliant on playas. Sometimes it is the only source of water in the area. However, again, I'm going to emphasize those dry periods are actually critical to the functionality, not only for recharge, but also for those annual plants, because if it stays wet all the time, you get more problems. Like in Nebraska, some of those playas are either pumped regularly with water or are just wet, way more frequency. We get a lot of more problems with invasive plants or monoculture plants such as reed canary grass, river bulrush, cattail. We're very fortunate here in this part of the country that we don't have a lot of those problems. One plant that is a little more problematic is Johnson grass, but that's usually an indicator for me that there's a lot of sediment sitting on top of that clay. For some reason that layer there of sediment sitting on top of the clay seems to be really good habitat for Johnson grass. So, and that can choke out some of your more annual and native species. So these are just a few different plant species that I commonly see in playas. So inside the playa, we talked already a lot about pink smartweed. That's the plant in my background. Great duck food. One of the top, curly duck. You see kind of in the middle to more kind of little fringe areas, you see a lot of curly duck in our playas. Plains coreopsis, that's that background picture. So this playa in particular is just this year because of as much moisture as we've received, the plains coreopsis just filled up the entire floor of this playa. Barnyard grass we had talked about, yes, not a non-native species of grass, but it doesn't seem to like overtake, and also really good duck food. Spike rush, I see a lot of spike rush. Actually, I had one producer tell me it grows his cows really good. I don't know how true that is, but he really likes it. So I see a lot of spike rush. And a little bit drier, you see a lot of pigweed and ragweed. And then again, there's a plethora of other species. So the pictures on the left side, that top picture's curly dock. That middle picture is your spike rush, and that bottom picture is a photo of pigweed. In terms of perimeter, and we talk about so much of the vegetation that is within the playa, but the perimeter is just as what's in the perimeter is actually just important to the health of the playa and how it functions. So in this region, we are a short grass prairie. So some common grasses and plants, buffalo grass, super great, pretty hardy, very deep roots. Then blue grama, cytos grama, little blue stem, and then a couple forbs, some scarlet mallow, plain zinnia and yucca. So on the right side of pictures, the top picture you see is your yucca plant. The middle picture is your plain zinnia, and the bottom one is a scarlet globe mallow. It's really pretty. We have a lot of that right now, again, because we've gotten a lot of moisture. I would like to point out as a practice that seems to be very beneficial for wildlife, but it's been shown through some research that older historical CRP plantings have shown to reduce playa inundation frequency relative to native pasture, and that a lot has to do with the species of grasses that they've kind of chosen to put in a lot of those traditional CRP plantings. The vegetation's a lot thicker or non-native, old world blue stem, and even some native grasses, which we don't have a lot out here, more of that mixed grass or tall grass prairie. We have some of it, but too much switchgrass, too much big blue stem and so forth. So when working in this area and looking at replanting pastures or putting areas in CRP, it's important to consider what is being planted, not only just for the upland, but it also can affect the playas themselves. So then I'm also going to hit on some wildlife. That left image there is the probability of playa inundation. Obviously, the further you move west, that probability drops drastically to frequency of inundation. And then it increases as you reach, the further east regions and you're getting off near the edge of the cap rock, which we call here. So playas are very, very important wintering grounds here in the region for waterfowl. Especially when we get like this really nice spring summer rain, we get a lot of food input into those playas, a lot of seeds from the pink smartweed and barnyard grass. Holds a lot of waterfowl. We host, a high percentage of cackling Canada geese in the area, and those stay around. Ducks will only kind of stay around if we actually have a lot of plies of water. Canada geese, they utilize urban areas really well, so they stick. And then sandhill cranes, we host a high percentage, and we also harvest 90% of all cranes in the Central Flyway area. Obviously, some threats to playas is alteration. These are examples, some pits, either a pit for cattle water or a pit for tailwater or road water catchment, which makes a playa non-functional. And then also playas, this kind of has two problems. There's a pit on the far side, and then it's also being farmed through, so that, and a road going through it. So 3 problems there on this playa. And a little harder, creates a lot of sediment and can be very expensive. The difference between a healthy playa versus an unhealthy playa, that bottom playa is a healthy playa. We restored that a couple of years ago. You see the water spreads across, vegetation is really healthy around it, versus to the north there is pitted, that you don't get that water spread across the whole footprint. And then here's just an example of a restoration that we recently did and got some rain, so I was able to get some good pictures of how that process changes how the playa functions. So, and then I'm here to answer any other questions that you may have.
Thanks, Heather. Our next speaker is Mary Carol Edwards. So Mary Carol is going to speak on the adventures in propagating native wetland plants. She founded Green Star Wetland Plant Farm in 2018 to meet a need for native aquatic species for all kinds of projects. And those could be backyard rain gardens to large acreage restorations. And she previously worked as a stormwater wetland specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service and their community watersheds partners. And since that time, she's also worked as a landscape designer in architecture firms, worked in genetics research at the Baylor College of Medicine and Rice University. She's a Houston native raised on Galveston Bay with a BS in biology and MA in architecture from the University of Houston. And she enjoys bringing both of those disciplines together to create wonderful natural settings. And so we're excited to hear this presentation from her. Welcome to Plant Party, Mary Carol, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone, and good morning. I realize that with the title Adventures in Propagating Native Wetland Plants, it sounds like I'm going to tell you all our zany anecdotes, like one time on a collecting trip to a private ranch, I got the trailer stuck in a ditch while the truck was in 2-wheel drive, and it took all 6 ladies in the company pushing it out while the tires spin couch on everybody. Very memorable. Another time I lost the truck key while back in the middle of nowhere, which is actually the property that's shown on the screen here. And a neighboring property was doing a prescribed burn, and we watched the flames getting closer and closer. We were very motivated to find the key, which we found just before it went into the pond. So these things happen, but really what I wanted to tell you about was this, the whole starting of a business like this. One of the few native wetland plant nurseries in this area on the Gulf Coast. And that has been an adventure, a nonstop adventure. So we have a farm in Alvin, Texas. And I want to tell you a little bit about how it came to be here, how I came to be a plant farmer. I worked at AgriLife Extension for about 10 years as a wetland restoration assistant, and then as a stormwater wetland specialist. The office was Texas Community Watershed Partnership in Clear Lake City. I learned to identify plants, propagate, collect, manage, maintain, design wetlands. And I also did a lot of reporting on grants and writing for grants. And let me tell you, I like growing of plants, the growing of plants much better. So because I could see there was an increasing demand for native, locally sourced wetland plants, I decided to take the leap and be the source for the plants that I could see was going to be increasingly needed. We're wholesale primarily, but we do sell to the public on 1 day a month. Our farm here, as you can see at the plan there, it's about 3 miles from Alvin, and it's south of Houston, and it is itself was once a wetland. So visiting this land, I could see that it was going to be an excellent place to grow aquatic species. So what is driving the demand that I mentioned? I'll go through a few of the sort of wet landscape types that are needing locally sourced, ideally, aquatic plants. Rain gardens, which are shallow depressions that go through wet and dry cycles and receive water off of the landscape, a building, roadway, and in a temporary fashion. It goes through wet cycles and goes through dry cycles as well. Bioswales are similar, except it's kind of a conveyance for the water. You might think of it as a ditch. On the left side, there's a more informal bioswale at the farm that we're using to grow out wetland species and as a demonstration garden. And then on the right, it can be a highly engineered thing also, like you see here on Bagby Street. Bog gardens are using, or bog filters are using the capacity of wetland plants to take up nutrients. So the water flowing through them is much cleaner. This is here at the Houston Zoo. Staff working to collect plants and thin our plantings. Ponds and lakes. Adding wetland plants to ponds and lakes provides fish habitat, microinvertebrate habitat, beauty, many benefits. Container gardening, floating wetlands, marsh restoration. We heard a little bit about that earlier this morning. And really, I think the greatest driver for the need for wetland plants has been stormwater detention basins. At the same time that the demand for plants is increasing, their natural populations are decreasing due to habitat destruction. I think we've all heard about the loss of wetlands and on the coastal plain. It's happening everywhere, but to see it happen in my professional lifetime is astonishing. This picture that I'm showing here is kind of representative. We have mowing, over mowing, which reduces plant populations and favors invasives, the construction in the background. The detention basin that was provided to hold the water is a source of wetlands, but the diversity in a created wetland is really nothing like the diversity in an established wetland, a reference wetland. That could be another talk. So I wanted to mention a few things about the best things about managing a business like this. And you'll notice as I go through these photos that there are a lot of people in them as well as plants. So I have to give a shout out to the people. Those who work with native plants tend to be just the best people. But since this is the plant party, I'm going to focus more on the plants. I did mention that there was a demand, which is wonderful. I think that the best thing is that we are growing plants that are so perfectly adapted for the conditions that we're putting them in. They're very tough. So they tolerate dry periods after they're established, like these little iris that you see here. They don't mind the soils that make other gardeners fret. They like saturated soils. They like anoxic soils, clay, and there's no problem with the freeze. As a new farmer, when we had these two heavy freezes in the past years, people asked me, well, how much did you lose? And we lost nothing really. Our stocks looked bad for a little while, but they all came back because these freezes are not out of the ordinary. When you look at take the long view, these plants have evolved with extremes of heat and cold. Here's an example. You see these same sets of iris now in 3 or 4 inches of water. This is typical, their ability to go through the wet and dry cycles. And then on the other hand, maybe the not best, one of the challenges of this business is that the plants are the horticulture of the plants, the supply of the plants is ramping up, and yet the demand is not quite meeting that. And so we have, for example, plant lists will come for projects that are not as reality-based as they should be. We have, maybe it's like a little bit of an Amazon mentality where if somebody says, well, these plants in this book are native to this region of Texas, so we'll just have 800 of each of these. Can you get them to us in 2 weeks? Really, I've had requests like that. And so at this point, it is not possible to do. The pictures that I'm showing here kind of illustrate something that we're working with. We had a project where the rupia was specced in 1 gallon pots. As you can see from what I'm holding, this is wintertime, but it has very, very fine leaves. It has roots coming out everywhere. And to get that thing to grow and stay in a 1 gallon pot is, it's kind of a magic trick. It's really not ideal to plant in a 1 gallon pot. It's more ideal to take a big clump and throw it in the water and let it propagate itself. In the middle photo, you see the staff are working with trying to divide it, encourage it, and manage it in 1 gallon pots. And then on the right, you see our experiments with growing it in rock wool plugs, which was more successful. So the horticulture, as I mentioned, is still being developed for a lot of these species, which have not been commercially available or just beginning to be commercially available. The lead time is really important. So this is something that designers, engineers really should take into consideration. And I'll walk you through a little bit of the aspects of making plants commercially available. Sourcing seeds is part of what we do. We try to source from as wide a variety of locations as we can. But in order to do that, we need to build relationships with landowners. That takes time. We need to have sources from salt marshes to forested riverine settings. And we need to be able to know what is getting ripe, what can be collected. We need to train staff. We need to hire and retain staff to be able to identify and collect seeds. Other plants are best propagated by divisions, essentially. It's just much easier to do by dividing existing plants or taking a portion of a plant in the wild. And knowing which are better to propagate by divisions and seeds is part of the whole horticulture adventure. Here's vegetative propagation. You see us working with frog fruit and with Carolina glasswort. Again, plants that if you were to start from seed would be really impracticable or impossible. So sometimes when I get plant lists requesting frog fruit by seed, I really wonder about that. We have done seed germination in various ways. On the left, you see these flats here. We've kind of done like mass seeding here just to see what will start at certain times of the year, certain water levels and so forth. Sometimes we had old seed or seeds that had been collected a couple years ago before we had the opportunity to grow them out, or the request to grow them out. And that picture on the left, you see on the left side there, irises that are in 4-inch pots. So what we've been doing is growing them out in kind of like mass flats and then putting individuals in 4-inch pots. That's fairly labor intensive. So it looks like we're going to need to have different approaches, like seeding directly into plugs. And I think that our experience over the last few years gives us the confidence to be able to seed in a way that's not going to just waste the space in the hoop house. Plant maintenance and prep. Once you get those things up, they need constant attention. On the right, you see new lizard tail. We keep plants, try to keep them covered in water, the pots covered in the water, because it does reduce the germination of bothersome weeds. And on the left, you see the crew working with something, I think that was creeping spot flower. By the time we got to the stalks to take care of them, they had really overgrown. But an advantage to that is that you can just cut the stems off and create new plants as you're preparing. Distribution, you've got to get plants out into the world. Sometimes people come and pick them up, which is great. And sometimes we do deliveries. You see a stormwater basin at the John Paul Landing Park near Katy here being planted by boat last year. And the crew is loading here. We rent a truck to convey the plants. That has worked out pretty well. Each one of these aspects I'm talking about, I feel like could be their own talk. There's so much into them, and yes, adventures as well. A part of what I like to do is outreach. I think that I'm very passionate about my job, and I love to talk about it. I love to promote the value of wetlands, the value of native plants. And so we've had groups come out to the farm. One time it was plein air painting. Many times it's just walking the property. You may recall in the plan that I first showed, much of the farm is undeveloped. I intend to create a tall grass prairie to be a source for us to collect plants, as well as much needed restoration. Here we've got students from AgriLife internship. Above is an outdoor Afro group who came for a tour and a book reading. Many groups have come, and I really enjoyed sharing the farm and the plants with them. Another thing that is important to me now is encouraging other growers. So there's some backyard growers who are beginning, some new wetland growers in the area, and I applaud that, because every region of Texas needs to have its own wetland plant supply. Just as it doesn't make sense to plant a wetland in say Houston, Texas, with plants from Florida or North Carolina, just because they have the same species name. It's not ideal to have plants from Alvin going to, say, the Panhandle. So we need to have our own wetland sources all over the all over Texas. I mentioned that we're primarily wholesale. I do want to be able to make our native plants available to the public. So once a month, usually it's the last Saturday of the month, in the morning, we have an open farm day. These are our next upcoming dates in July and August. So I hope to see you all come.
So we really appreciate your presentation, and we'll move right into the next one. So this is going to be about managing livestock around wetlands with Leanne Wiley. Leanne is an extension program specialist and manager for the Lone Star Healthy Streams program with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. The goal of the Lone Star Healthy Streams program is to encourage the protection of Texas waterways from bacterial contamination originating from livestock operations and feral hogs that may pose a serious health risk to Texans. Leanne organizes and conducts events throughout Texas discussing science-based evidence of best management practices for healthy watersheds and for healthy water bodies. Leanne received her Bachelor of Science in Animal Science from Texas A&M Kingsville and completed her Master of Science in Animal Science with Texas A&M College Station. She's been an exchange student in Brazil, a university lecturer, and was a rangeland management specialist in NRCS for 5 years before starting with AgriLife in 2021. I'll turn it over to you, Leanne. Looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you to Dr. Clayton and everyone that hosts these plant parties quarterly thanks for inviting me. So again, I'm Leanne Wiley. I'm a little familiar with wetlands. I grew up in Matagorda County and it's pretty wet there all the time. And so managing livestock around wetlands is what we're going to discuss. But first, I wanted to kind of just give a little plug for my program. It's Lone Star Healthy Streams, and there's a website here on the right side. And what that program is really about is just protecting Texas waterways from bacteria contamination that originates from livestock, wildlife, and invasive species. I listed as invasive species because feral hogs are a big topic that we discuss, and they're not wildlife, they are invasive. And so the contamination from these species pose a huge health risk for Texans because of the bacteria left in the water and the Texans using that water for various activities, drinking water, recreation, whatever it might be. And so this program is funded through, originally from the Clean Water Act. It's funneled from the federal level as a 319 non-point source grant that funnels through the Texas State Soil and Water Conservation Board. And so that's where my grant funding comes from. I'm completely supported by the state board. The objectives of the program are creating that awareness, so what I'm doing now, of the bacteria issue that is associated from the animals, and then providing education materials to farmers, ranchers, landowners, master naturalists, any type of group that will let me get in front of them at this point. It started more directly at the landowners, but it's kind of evolved more now that we need everyone to be aware and try to just get this material in front of whoever. Every person is concerned because everyone's using water daily. And then lastly, where this goes back towards more of the landowner, farmer, rancher, is going to be encouraging some implementation of voluntary practices, which I'm going to just list a few off in a couple slides. The programs that I do are in person, and resources can be available in person, but they're also available online at my website. And then we also use AgriLife Learn. If you've ever used AgriLife before, it used to be called the bookstore, now it's called AgriLife Learn, and you can find all of my resources by using the tag LSHS. So it makes it a little bit easier to find all of the resources by using that tag. So just a little graphic of what the bacteria problem actually looks like. This is from the 2022 report from TCEQ, where the bacteria impairment waterways that were actually labeled as impaired, where they all are across the state. You can see there are some heavy concentrations more on the eastern, central eastern, and Gulf Coast areas. In that 2020 report, of the 2,000 bodies that were assessed, half of them were labeled impaired, and of the ones labeled impaired, about 33% of those were impaired because of the bacteria. So it's a pretty significant issue. Normally at an in-person program, what I would be talking about is those best management practices, and I usually break them up into two types. And so most of the time I'm looking at like your upland management for vegetation management, talking about grazing, building a grazing plan, and then I transition to a more riparian style and having some different practices discussed there. So today I'm kind of going to put those overlapping together and talk a little bit about grazing management towards the wetland side. This is my typical slide where I talk about there are different types of grazing systems. And I always tell producers, I am not here to tell you how to do it. There are lots of ways you need to manage how it works best for you. This is where I would give a plug for AgriLife Extension in the county, NRCS, and your SWCD groups. They have people who are available locally to help you design a grazing plan that fits specifically your needs. And so that's my plug for the local folks in the areas, because it's going to make more sense to work with those folks than to maybe try to go online and find a grazing plan and try to adapt that to your property. So it could be continuous, it could be rotational. The most important thing, the most critical aspect is knowing the stocking rate. What is the carrying capacity of your land? What can be held there? And then understanding that that's an ever-changing number, and it needs to be changed and manipulated as the seasons change. If we're going into a drought, has the land use changed on a certain part of the property, so the acreage that's actually grazable changes. And so those are a few things to consider. I do have my full grazing livestock program for Lone Star Healthy Streams as an online course, again, available at the AgriLife Learn store. And that's free. All of my resources are free. You just have to go in and I think actually like go to AgriLife Learn, put in your email, it's going to email it to you, and then you can take the course or read the resources from there. So more in-depth resources are available online, or you can email me and I can try to send it to you if that's a little easier. So grazing a wetland, again, I normally talk about grazing as an upland type management tactic, but you would be grazing wetlands in certain scenarios if you're trying to utilize cattle or any type of livestock as a tool. And so there are more additional considerations that I would want to consider when you're doing it over a wetland. First of all, is that wetland fenced out? Is it being fenced out and being used as more of a specific area for other types of animals? Is it something that you can put cattle in, contain them, control that, and then be able to exclude them from a specific area? Within that, you're going to be wanting to consider the timing, because you're going to look at, this is more where the plant side would come in, and my wetland experts are going to know more of this specifics than I can probably spout out in the next few minutes. But every species is going to have that growing season, and you're not going to want to graze plants down when they're trying to actually be producing. It's more preferable to graze in the dormant season, especially if you're trying to control an invasive species. By using cattle to graze that down. You don't want to be grazing if the banks are really saturated, so after a heavy rain or something like that. So this is where the landowner has to really be out and observing their property to know, like, is it time to let them in? Oh, we should hold off. Let's do this after we've had a chance to dry out. Another big one, depending on where you are, is ground nesting birds and what seasons they're coming through. When I was with NRCS in Matagorda County, we had some producers that were looking into working with Audubon and becoming part of the program that they've created called conservation ranching, where it actually gets certified that you are bird friendly with your ranching, and you're rotating and moving your cattle out whenever it's time for those ground nesting birds to need that space. It could be the opposite, maybe, where you're trying to graze certain species of plants down. So you're trying to open it up to allow more waterfowl in, to give them that more open water feel. Duration, frequency, how long are the cattle in there? How often are you going to put them in? The most important thing to consider is that length of recovery. How long is it going to take for certain species of grasses to come back after a grazing period or a disturbance? One thing to maybe also consider is putting in a grazing enclosure and having a small fenced out area, so you can kind of see after the animals have gone through, this is where we were and this is where we are, and leaving that enclosure really year round, so you can kind of see what is happening in the undisturbed portion of the wetland area. It's really more commonly, everything that I read is more commonly to look at wetlands and riparian areas and grazing them in what's more referred to as the flash or the mob grazing. So more cattle, less time. But again, I'm not here to tell producers how to do it specifically. They need to understand what plants they're looking at, the wetland style that they're looking at, and how they can actually manage that. I came across several resources. I just kind of threw this in last minute. I think this is not in Texas, but it was more how can using cattle as a tool to help not only reduce maybe some of those invasive species, but also you're helping some of the other critters in the wetland areas as well. So this was a advocate type poster for helping this California tiger salamander with its habitat. So the cattle were let in, they were more likely to want to graze down those non-native plants, and that really helped the habitat for this salamander. And so I had a little research to do, and so this is kind of one thing I came across, but ultimately I ended up falling back on some of my Lone Star Healthy Streams information and a couple other things that I'll reference in a moment. So more of that riparian protection best management practices that I would usually go over in my programs are, I mentioned fencing and having those areas fenced out so you can better control that, and hopefully be able to keep the cattle excluded. That's not always a feasible option. Fencing is very expensive. And so if you're not able to completely exclude animals from an area, you can try doing a couple other things to just discourage or even encourage them to just be away from that wetland or stream creek area. And so a couple things that I have listed here, I won't go into detail, is just having more in-stream watering points, meaning you do have a little bit of fencing or you have a specific area that the cattle can get to the water, get their drink, but it's not full access to the water, because that's why they're down there, is they're wanting to get water and shade. A couple others that are, if you have no fencing, how can you encourage those animals to just stay out of that wet area? Well, they're there for water and they're there for shade. So build alternative structures, whether that's putting in a well in a trough, again, expensive, but they could be options if you're wanting to conserve that wetland area. Shade structures, you can build those from whatever's in the barn. A lot of farmers and ranchers are very creative. So just providing some sort of alternative shade, maybe planting some trees, just giving them somewhere else to get out of the hot Texas sun, which we all can really relate to here lately. And then just moving around their feed and their minerals, encouraging them to kind of not concentrate in specific areas, and don't put those things right upstream from a water source. These are a couple of the manuals that I have for different species. There's that online course in the top left, and the website where, again, you said you can find all of the resources. And then these are specific fact sheets for each of those BMPs that I briefly just mentioned. So kind of to bring this back into the plant side of things, and where cattle maybe can play a good role or maybe be detrimental. I ended up falling on the resource more so the Remarkable Riparian. And so that's a book that I've gotten when I attended the Texas Riparian and Stream Ecosystem Training. So if you've not attended one of those, I would definitely say find out where they are. They're partnered with Texas Water Resource Institute. And you'll get these resources there. I don't know if you guys can see in the video, but it is a nice book. It's got a lot of your riparian plants, specifically in Texas. And so I was just going to kind of run through a few of those, that not all of them, because a lot of them are not something that cattle are going to graze. But Eastern Gamagrass, it's a really great riparian type plant because it's going to have great stability. It's something that you would want to manage to have consistently there because of that stability. But cattle also like it. And so this is where your grazing plan would be. It would be really critical to have that grazing plan in place so they're not overgrazing. And so this would be, again, more of that rotational mob grazing, and then giving that plant a chance to rest after the mob has come through and actually grazed it down. It's a similar story for the switchgrass, another very palatable grass for livestock. It's also another one that you would want to keep in those areas because it's going to have that root strength for holding up banks. And this is also desirable, and many of these plants are desirable not just for livestock, but for other types of animals as habitat and food. Gulf cordgrass, I'm not sure who's all familiar with some of these plants. It's a plant party, so I imagine y'all have gone over a ton of them, but Gulf cordgrass is one I'm familiar with, being from Matagorda County. It does have a very dense root system, and it helps control erosion, so it is a desirable plant to keep out there. It does populate and take over. And it's not as desirable for cattle, but if it is burned or it's tough to shred because it's in a wet area, but it's common practice where I was from in Matagorda County for it to be burned, and then the cattle be put out a couple times a year, usually in November and April when they're moving cattle on and then off again. That's a more palatable grass, and those cattle will spend months out there grazing that down off the Matagorda Island. And so they do this, like I said, twice a year. They move them out to the island and then back because they're out there, and that's what they're living on, is the Gulf cordgrass. Sedges is another one that there's kind of ups and downs. The flat and nut sedge that I'm a little bit familiar with from working with a lot of landowners in the NRCS. It's something that can be very frustrating for those producers, but it also can be an indicator plant because it's going to show you where you have moisture in your soils. And so it's unfortunately something that's got a ton of seeds, each of these plants, and will move across different pastures. So your pasture may not have had it in years past, and then all of a sudden you have it, and it's very difficult to control. I've had many producers tell me that in a mature state, cattle will graze this. I had one producer try to convince us that this was something his cattle were just living off of. No one else said that, but he had just complete confidence that his cattle were grazing it down, and that's what they were sustaining on. So to each their own, I guess. It just depends on maybe what stage of life the plant is in. I don't want to down talk a lot of all the sedges because Cherokee sedge is actually one that cattle will graze. And it's something that they can overgraze just like any of the other plants. So it has to be very carefully managed. So I think the first two sedges, the nut and flat sedge, are less desirable. They tend to be a little bit more of a thicker, rougher, fibrous stem and not something that cattle are going to graze. And so they end up grazing around it and you're left with a field just full of this. But again, I said it could be an indicator plant that would show you where your moisture is. And then your cattle actually kind of graze all around it. And then you know all of a sudden that you do have a problem. So if you're looking at a field that has these big opens or these big spaces of these green patches, it might be an actual issue, but the cattle have helped you identify it. Someone had mentioned spike rush earlier. I did not change the picture, so that's not the correct photo. But I did want to put out there that spike rush is something that cattle will graze. It can be very sensitive. And so if it's disturbed too much, it does take a little bit for it to colonize back and have its effectiveness in the wetland as well. But it is something that cattle can graze. Dallas grass is another, is now where we're kind of transitioning to. These are some of the issues where cattle can maybe be helpful. It is considered a noxious weed in parts of Texas, but it is something that cattle will graze. It's very nutritious, has a high nutritional value, more so than even Bahia grass, which is a very common upland grass that producers will try to graze. It does have a few issues that if it gets the fungus on there, it will make cattle sick. It's a fungus on the seed head. So again, something that has to be kind of managed for the safety of the livestock. Torpedo grass, I was not very familiar with this one, but it is one that it's in your wetlands. It's not native and it is invasive. It's difficult to control, but what I did find is that it is a good forage for cattle and that they will go in and graze it down. So that could be a positive for having livestock in your wetlands and doing some of that flash and mob grazing. Basie grass, it can be, it's a non-native and invasive, and it's usually mistaken for a lot of our more native type plants, but it's one that cattle will graze more so when it's a mature plant. If it's grown to its more mature state, it's going to be too fibrous and it's not going to be very palatable for those livestock. So that was kind of my quick run over of some of the plants that I was able to find that, livestock maybe could be beneficial to come in, flash graze, get some of those invasive species out of there, allow some of that space to open up where maybe more of your natives or your more desirable plants would maybe have a chance to come back in. And so a little bit of research I did find shows that is true, that species richness would increase as cattle were grazing. And so you could also maybe try to reduce that dominant species that's there by having them come in and make it less competitive. One thing to consider is like how many and how heavy is the grazing, how much you might be hurting that above ground biomass and the root biomass. What a study had found in 2002 is that the root biomass really would not be so much impacted unless you were doing a very heavy amount of grazing. Of course, your above ground biomass is going to be hit a little bit harder, even at the moderate level. But as long as that root system is there and strong, I would think you would still see a decent comeback. I'm saying that you permit a good rest period after the grazing period has actually happened. And so either of those types of ideas, it can be affected by the species of livestock. I kept referring a lot more to cattle because that's a lot of times what I talk about, but I did find several studies where there was a little bit more discussion on sheep and goats being used as grazers within wetlands. And so they're going to have a different selection of plants that they're going to want to graze. And so you might see different outcomes depending on the species of livestock that you're going to use, just because they have a different feeding preference and a different behavior. Sheep don't really like to be super wet, so they may not be the best option if you're trying to graze down an area. And then cattle do prefer grasses over more of your woody type species. So that might mean where sheep and goats might be something that are brought in if you're looking at some of those more woody species. So that's kind of just a quick summary. Again, I manage Lone Star Healthy Streams, and it's a program that runs across the state. We are trying to target any and everyone, more so your landowners, but those that are involved in just land stewardship in general. So if you're able to come out and come see me in person, I put together programs, like I said, that mention livestock, feral hogs, and a variety of animals. So here's my upcoming programs. There's my information. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to that Remarkable Prairie Field Guide. That's the book that I referred to for the plants specifically. So thank you.
Thank you, Leanne. That was fantastic. A lot of great information. Our final speaker is Brittany Chesser. She's with the Aquatic Vegetation Management, and she's a program specialist for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. She's a Delaware native, but she graduated from Delaware State University with a BS in Natural Resources. She later went on to receive her master's in Wildlife Fisheries and Aquaculture at Mississippi State University, working on commercial scale low salinity culture techniques for Gulf killifish. Brittany assumed her current role in 2019, where her primary duties include providing technical expertise on aquatic vegetation management to the public through identifying plant species, recommending correct management practices, and delivering presentations and outreach materials, along with serving as the lab specialist for the TAMU Aquatic Diagnostics Laboratory. The soon-to-be Dr. Chesser is working towards her PhD in the Department of Rangeland, Wildlife, and Fisheries Management at Texas A&M.
Hey all, like Megan mentioned, my name is Brittany Chesser and I work for Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And in my role as the Aquatic Vegetation Management Program Specialist, I usually focus on management. So this is when landowners or county extension agents or other managers come to me, usually when things go south or get out of hand and want to know how to take care of it. But algae definitely have a role in the environment. So we're going to cover them a little bit more in detail. Okay, so what are algae? Algae are not true vascular plants. So generally speaking, they are primitive non-seed bearing plants and have no roots, stems, or true leaves. And so there are over 30,000 known and named algal species out there, but some studies have actually demonstrated that it's probably closer to 100,000. So a lot of different species that we're working with. And so some algae species are more favorable than others, but just like with your diet, too much of anything usually isn't good for you and usually isn't sustainable. Because there are so many species with various characteristics, we can further break them down into 3 different categories. So we have our planktonic algae or planktonic forms, and these are microscopic, single-celled, free-floating algae that exist virtually wherever the sun penetrates. Filamentous algae or filamentous forms are made of single cells that form these long visible chains or cells from end to end that make threads and filaments, and they all intertwine, and sometimes they resemble wet cotton or wool. Our macroalgae or macro forms have the appearance of having stems and leaflets, but they are a form of multicellular algae, and they just consist of large algal cells. So we're first going to begin with what can be deemed as good. So this is going to be our planktonic algae or planktonic forms. And so because they are microscopic, identification does require a microscope to see cells or colonies. And there are many different key characteristics to ID. And so this can be including chloroplast presence, number per cell, shape, or color. And so here you can see this is one of our more common freshwater species, and we're just pointing to a few of the characteristics within that colony. And so we're really looking at the shape of each of these, if they have multiple nuclei, different things like that. So it does take someone who is skilled in terms of identifying planktonic algae. Planktonic algae are also known as phytoplankton, and they're what actually gives the water that greenish tint that you see. And so remember, clear water isn't always an indicator of healthy or good water. So water chemistry and water quality can't be visually made. So keep that in mind. Clear water does not equal good. Typically, planktonic algae are considered desirable in moderate amounts because they do shade the pond bottom, which suppresses the establishment of some of our unwanted rooted aquatic vegetation, especially in those deeper areas where you really don't need them. It's harder to manage. And a lot of our aquatic vegetation or true plants can cause oxygen issues once they get out of hand. They're also the foundation of a pond's food chain. So our planktonic algae provide food for zooplankton and larval fish, and it just goes all the way up from there. So if you have sport fish in your pond, they are benefiting from planktonic algae. And also they produce a very large percentage of oxygen in the water. So typically when we're looking at stagnant or calm waters, so not a lot of flow, not necessarily a lot of wind and wave action, they're producing about 80% of that oxygen in the system. So they're very important compared to some of our other types of aquatic vegetation that usually consume more oxygen than they produce. Planktonic algae populations can become too dense and create nuisance blooms. And so bloom densities can be determined as beneficial or problematic through measuring water clarity. So you can use something like a Secchi disc, which you see at the top two photos. And so a bloom is considered to be good when there is 18 to 24 inches of water clarity, and a bloom is considered to be too dense when there is less than 15 inches of clarity. And so blooms that are too dense can cause low dissolved oxygen fish kills. And so that's one of the main things that we would be concerned about if a bloom is too dense. Additionally, planktonic algae can be mixed in with microscopic blue-green algae, which is also known as cyanobacteria. So you might have heard of that in the news, especially within the past couple of years. And blue-green algae will actually use toxins as a defense mechanism in hot and dry conditions to outcompete with those non-harmful planktonic species, which can be detrimental to any person or animal in contact with the water. And so you don't want to get into bloom conditions because once the resources start running out, this can shift more towards the cyanobacteria population. Next, we'll discuss the bad and the ugly. So these are filamentous forms or filamentous algae. And so to distinguish between different species of filamentous algae, magnification is required just to see individual filaments. And so cells are joined together end to end, but one key characteristic is looking at different types of filament branching. So are your filaments completely unbranched? Are they falsely branched, which you see on the left-hand side, where the cells do not actually touch, or they're not actually integrated into that branching? And at the bottom right, you can see what's actually called true branching, where those cells are actually integrated and they're actually touching within that, what we call an algal sheath. And so that's just one of the characteristics that we immediately look for underneath the microscope. Filamentous algae grow along the bottom of a pond like a carpet in shallow areas, usually during the spring. And healthy filaments are dark green in color, coarse, and difficult to pull apart. However, these filamentous algae species have different heat and UV intolerances, and they'll begin to die off as the water temperature increases. So you'll see them dying off in mid to late summer months. And during that period, gases during decomposition get caught in those filaments, and it causes these cells to form what you see on the right-hand side, which is floating mats. And so the appearance of these mats are more yellowish and green in color. They're more slimy, they fall apart really easily, and that's just because they're stressed, dead, or dying. Like all things, filamentous algae does have a role in the environment, just like I mentioned earlier on. This is the #1 thing I do get calls about in terms of management, but it can be beneficial for some organisms. It can serve as a food source for some of our protozoans and invertebrates. It also provides habitat for some of our aquatic insects, Just remember that this can also be for our mosquitoes and midges, so maybe some of our nuisance insect species. They can provide a nice little sanctuary for them. And they can also act as a spawning surface for bait fish. However, most of the time it is considered a nuisance. So filamentous algae can also be mixed in with filamentous forms of blue-green algae or cyanobacteria species. But the main concern that we have with filamentous algae is that when it dies off during the warmer summer months, the oxygen or the holding capacity for oxygen is already low. So the warmer your water is, the less oxygen that it is able to hold. And when we have large amounts of mats dying off, the decomposition process comes at an oxygen expense. And so basically, in order to break down those mats, it requires beneficial bacteria that consume oxygen while they're breaking down those filamentous algal mats. And so this can create low dissolved oxygen issues, which may result in fish kills. So that's one of the main ones that we see. But also it's not aesthetically pleasing. It's pretty smelly if you've ever dealt with it, especially if you've ever raked it out of your pond and put it up against the edges. It hinders recreation. We're talking about boating, swimming, fishing. You don't want to go into your pond and come out looking like a swamp monster. And it can also clog pipes, which can be detrimental for those that are using their water for irrigation. And so I know this is more of a wetland setting, but I thought I would give you kind of all of the rundown. And also, once it has established, it's pretty difficult to control just because it reproduces so easily from multiple methods. So these can be spores, fragments, and also cell division. Moving on to our last category of algae. It's a little weird. So this is our macroalgae. So the identification of macroalgae is a little bit easier than some of these other forms. Magnification usually is only needed to get down to species, and it's not usually required down to genus. And so Chara and Nutella species are very common macroalgae genera here in Texas. They're pretty commonly confused with some of our true aquatic plant species just because they are submersed with the appearance of whorled branches and branchlets at the nodes around the central stem. But remember, these are not true leaves. So even though we may be talking about branches or branchlets, when we're identifying them, just know that these aren't true leaves, and this is quite different than our vascular plants. They do require a lot of sunlight, so they're usually found in clear waters, and they're typically anchored by colorless rhizoids, or some of the fragments can be found floating, and so they do not need to be rooted in the sediment. So here's a comparison of the two common types of macroalgae that I mentioned. Nutella over on the left is also known as stoneworts, and they're typically dark green in color. They're odorless and they're soft to the touch, and they have many forked branches. And so Chara on the right-hand side is also known as muskgrass just because it has a very strong odor when you crush it up into your hand. And it is coarse and green to gray in color because it actually draws calcium carbonate out of the water. Chara species have very cylindrical whorled branches in regular intervals with 6 to 16 branchlets around each node. But the branchlets are undivided, and that's one of the ways that you can tell it apart from some of our true vascular plants as well. So here with our macroalgae, it's typically not a nuisance in small amounts. It does have its benefits. It's consumed by waterfowl, and it does provide habitat for our aquatic insects, which are later either consumed by waterfowl or become part of the aquatic food chain. But there is concern for shallow water impoundments. And so they can take over shallow areas with clear water very quickly, as you can see in this photo on the right. And Our Chara species can actually lower hardness in a very small water body over time, just because, again, they precipitate calcium out of the water column, which makes up our total hardness. And so this can be detrimental to fish populations, especially our larval fish that need high levels of total hardness and calcium for bone and scale formation. And so it can be detrimental, just like any other type of algae. So there's several different resources for algae. If you really want to take a deep scientific dive and look at a ton of different species, AlgaeBase is one that I use all of the time, especially when I'm trying to identify if I'm looking underneath of a microscope. And then I'd be remiss if I didn't plug our website that I manage. This is the Aquaplant website. So it's aquaplant.tamu.edu. And if you go and hit identify a plant, not only can you look at algae, just general classifications of algae, but you can also look at many different species of aquatic vegetation, how to identify it. And if you were interested in management, we have that on there as well. We also have aquatic vegetation fact sheets that you can print out or download for free. One of them is actually a algae identification and management manual. So I highly recommend you check it out, especially if you are playing around in water and want to identify what you're looking at. So thank you, everyone.
Thanks to Brittany for that presentation. We'd like to thank our door prize sponsors, Bamert Seed, Enview Range and Pasture, Quail Forever, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service, Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service Aquatic Diagnostics Laboratory, Texas Brigades, and USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. We appreciate all of your support of Plant Party and those who support us through the giving of those door prizes. Thanks again to all of our speakers, and thanks to all of you. That was our 11th Plant Party webinar, and we are planning more. So this is a quarterly webinar series hosted by the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, and the Texas A&M AgriLife Extension Service. And we will be sending a link to a short survey by email, or you can type in the address you see there on the screen and chat box, or we'll pop up a QR code that you can simply hold your phone camera over and click on the link that pops up. The next Plant Party you can put on your calendars for September 27th, and that'll be about plant identification and classification. So bring your learning cap for some nomenclature fun. We will send an email with more information to all the past registrants, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks, everybody.